critical log. So I'll just pop the Google Doc login to the chat. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce this month Brian Rowe and colleague and Lee, as I recall. Your project presentation, recipes, Food Waste Ontology Initiative, and I trust you to introduce yourself and your operating context. And so over to you, Brian.
Thanks all. Yes, happy to present to this group today. This is work out of the recipes group, resilient, equitable, circular innovation for partnerships and education synergies. This is part of the Sustainable Regional Systems Research Network grants funded by NSF. We were one of two networks funded in the 2021 round. A lot of our work here is Rand and I have been leading a lot of it, but heavily in partnership with Matthew Lang and other groups of Icicle as well. They've been very instrumental in helping us at Recipes think critically about data issues, including ontology issues. And we're working towards some joint projects between these two networks. Icicle is another large NSF grant focused on artificial intelligence. So Recipes Network is founded around the core concept, kind of a compelling fact that about a third of all food never ends up in a human stomach. So that suggests some major issues that could be addressed that deal with sustainability, resilience, and equity. We've come from the point of view that much of food systems research has been motivated by a linear vision and early attempts to deal with food that's lost and wasted along this linear system has kind of worked through a hierarchy of production, recovery, recycling, and then eventual landfill as being the priorities. So in a sense, a vision of transforming wastes. But the vision of this research network is to think more circularly about this through a lens of convergence, one of NSF's favorite words, to think about really putting together different disciplines in a way that's very meaningful and informed by local knowledge of those people suffering the social consequences of the phenomenon that we're looking at, through great inclusion and also through educational elements. And to think much more circularly about this. So rather than transforming wastes, we really have a vision of transforming regional systems, all with an eye towards sustainability, equity, and resilience, and all through the lens of wasted food. And the network that we've created is constituted of over 40 researchers. I think it's up to 15 institutions now. People keep moving, so we add a few more here and there, along with lots of partners from across the food system that have been part of our effort. We launched back in the autumn of 2021, so kind of somewhat early COVID. We're all looking forward to our first in-person network meeting in June of this year. So we have never had a chance to initiate the network in person, so we're looking forward to that. I'm at Ohio State University, but you can see the regional reach of participating organizations, including Ned Spang and others at Davis, representing the West Coast. Also note and plug for any of you who are involved with undergraduate students that as part of the Recipes network, we have generated and stood up a undergraduate food systems science journal titled Food Fuel. A bit tricky to say, but very potent in terms of its vision. We just launched that. We're accepting undergraduate student submissions over a broad array of topics. And there's an email address here if you've got students who might be interested or colleagues who are teaching undergrads where You've seen very strong papers come out of those classes that might be suitable for an undergraduate publication. So Recipes is a huge entity, research network. One of the key clusters that I lead is the data cluster, and some of the aspirations that we have is essentially to bring data on wasted food kind of on par with that of energy and water. We know that's a slog because, of course, by the term waste, typically not as valued as much as something as energy or water, which are seen as great inputs rather than as byproducts or unwanted outputs of a production process. So we know that the motivation has never been there quite as urgently to track and create data along this. But as part of this aspiration, we obviously need to shape data interoperability. And we really want to help build out or contribute to existing ontologies in the area of wasted food. And some of our activities to do this is includes a scoping review in this domain and an ontology mapping project. We also are quite keen to generate additional data on wasted food. Part of that is a national tracking survey focused on household food waste that myself and others have stood up here at Ohio State and now have about 2 years of data under our belts. There's very little consistently gathered data over time on any types of wasted food. And so this is one of the few data sources that is now starting to do that. We also hope to use some techniques to go back and estimate household waste back through 2005 from some Nielsen scanner data as well. And we're also working to develop scalable methods so that data can be collected more quickly from digital photography of wasted food, either through scanning barcodes or using those digital images and working with some AI processes to make that identification and estimation much more smooth and integrated into data creation. And all this is to hopefully integrate, store, share, and visualize data in support of the network goals, which again is to improve the sustainability of the food system with a lens towards reducing wasted food as part of that. Some of our key projects, scoping review that we have underway, the tentative title of that manuscript is here, working with Matthew and Rand, who are also on this call, along with Ned Spang, who's also at Davis, and a few other names that may or may not be familiar to some of you on this call as well. We're still working on this, but we do have some initial takeaways. And one big takeaway is there just isn't much literature that has a very strong focus on ontologies that really point to food loss and waste. So we found about 7 articles out there in the peer-reviewed literature as we look back through typical databases. Among those articles and those ontologies, it was interesting that it was almost exclusively a focus of supporting valorization of wasted food. That is, trying to figure out how to take a waste stream and turn it into something more valuable. In fact, none that we identified support directly, at least, food recovery or rescue efforts. That is, trying to get food while it is still edible and move it to people who want to eat it, or prevention, trying to stop it in the first place. Also interesting, among those existing ontologies, there was pretty limited adherence to kind of best practices for ontology creation and maintenance, and really none that facilitated kind of ongoing or dynamic connectivity to other kind of well-founded and maintained ontologies. So those are some of our initial takeaways, and we're working towards getting that manuscript finished up and put into review. But all that kind of points to an obvious future focus, particularly on the ontology side, which is we really need to expand, ideally, and create, if needed, ontologies that support best practices as in this field, and those that really support reduction of food loss and waste, because That's typically the most sustainable response to food loss and waste, is to reduce it. And then also to support food rescue and recovery practices, that is getting food once it is created and not wanted by the primary target to another hungry human that can use it while it is still edible. And to do that, we really seek and hope to incorporate the input of critical stakeholders to help us develop a conceptual model. And so as we think through this, and very open to your suggestions here as well, we'll obviously want to include key government agencies who have maintained some food waste data bases in this area. USDA, EPA. FDA doesn't really maintain databases, but they do inform some of this discussion. And then key state players are starting to rise here, obviously, with 1383 in California, CalRecycle, and other state partners might be very critical, and other states like Vermont, New York, and others who are starting to require this as well. There'll be probably some interesting data initiatives stood up there. Key NGOs, REFED stands for Rethinking Food Waste through Economics of Data. They're kind of the go-to NGO in this space. They maintain a very, probably the most used database and data visualization tool in this space. World Wildlife Fund is very active in this area as well, as they try to limit food waste to get more land available for wildlife. And then, of course, Feeding America, with their extensive food bank network across the country, is a very important player as well. Obviously, we'll reach out to academics, and then obviously private and commercial sector, where there are key data issues in the food sector. The Krogers and Walmarts of the world are obvious points of data aggregation. Information players, Google, Winnow. I think Winnow actually has perhaps a private ontology that they use for they're a back of the house entity. They, along with LeanPath, they'll go into commercial kitchens, set up equipment to help measure the amount of waste being created, and then provide feedback so that firms can reduce their waste and basically pay for the system and then some more. And GS1 would be an obvious partner there as well. There's lots of firms in the valorization space, both at the digester level. Upcyclers, it's a new term that's out there to try to take food that can no longer be eaten by the intended target, but then can be reprocessed basically into a value-added item. And of course, waste management as well. And hopefully with the input of them, we can develop a conceptual model that can then be easily converted into needed ontological elements that can then inform either building out existing or bridging or, if needed, creation of new ontologies. So I'll pause there and see if that sparked any questions and see what your thoughts are.
That's great. Questions coming in from people? I have one or two, but
I'm trying to type them.
Okay, Diane, you don't have to put it in the meeting chat. You can just shoot it right out right now.
Okay. So grew up in a family of 6, had a large vegetable farm or almost an acre vegetable farm. But then you have kids and they move out. So if I want to buy kale, it's in a large bag, or I really want to have some of those small oranges, but they only come in a mesh bag. And I have 2 people, and I am trying to eat as much kale and oranges as I can, but I can only eat half of it, and it's going to get wasted. I know if I put it down in garbage disposal, it get composted and eventually ends up somewhere good. And if I don't buy the kale ever, because I might waste it, then I put the kale farmers out of business. So I'm trying to, I'm asking a sincere question, actually. What is the problem we're trying to solve on the food waste prevention? If I can't give a half bag of moldy kale to somebody because I don't have a place to bring it, what's the thing we're trying to do?
Yeah, no, these issues were addressed in part. I was part of the National Academy's panel that developed kind of recommendations for addressing consumer food waste, and really want to think systematically. And what you're pointing to are gaps in systematic issues. So portion sizing, package sizing are critical issues that go hand in hand with helping support consumers who do want to reduce waste. And so these are issues that have to be addressed more systematically. And there, the recommendations were to work with major manufacturers and retailers to think about modularity of food packaging and ways. Now, of course, this then raises an issue on the sustainability front that a little additional packaging also creates sustainability issues as well. But most LCA's life cycle assessments that I've seen suggest that so long as the packaging isn't too exotic, it's mainly plastic, and the metrics that you're concerned about are kind of carbon footprint metrics, a little extra packaging that is effective at reducing food waste is preferred over the additional food waste.
And is the
metrics that where plastic is a big thing, then
right?
Then
but is the and you probably have all this incorporated, but the profitability of the farmer in Florida or California, if I don't buy his stuff, no matter what I do with it, like if I just buy it and throw it in my yard, and I got a big pile of food waste, but if I don't buy it and nobody buys it, then that sustainability of having that source available can go away.
Yeah, so there's a fundamental tension here,
Yeah.
right? If we are successful and can actually reduce food waste, so a third of that food now only becomes maybe 20% of food being wasted, that's a substantial decline in demand. Luckily, global populations are growing, so total demand globally is increasing each year. So improving our food waste reduction is not going to undermine demand. It would make it more stagnant rather than increasing. But there could be, in the short run, if we were fantastically successful in reducing food waste, there would be general, what we, as an economist, we call a general equilibrium effect. And that would be beneficial for people who are very sensitive to food prices, because there'd be downward pressure on prices, which would be very helpful for those who are struggling with food security, and prices are very meaningful in terms of their ability to feed their families. But it may be also less profitable. And this is where World Wildlife Fund comes in, because they want to move that marginal land that's marginally productive out of production and back into wildlife habitat. And so that's kind of where the kind of the big plays are here in terms of food waste.
Yeah, because when because I come from a rural community, and it's like, no, if it doesn't make money, it's going to be a subdivision. It's not going back to the wildlife. And it's a complex thing, and I'll stop talking, but it's very complex.
Rainforest is one of the first parts of land that gets brought into marginal production.
Right, you're right. And it's like, if we don't give them food and money, then they're going to keep chopping down the rainforest, because that's the only way you're getting, sustainability for themselves. But it's it's just complex. But because if I'm selling turnips and then nobody eats them, I got to plow them, or maybe I do something else. But if I do all these vegetables and nobody buys them, then the vegetable farm goes away and it becomes a subdivision. So it doesn't go back to a non-paying entity like animals, who should have it back, or indigenous peoples, or there's not a trade mechanism for that. But I'll let other people go on. It's just complex.
I suspect that raises the free market versus planned economy thing around what we're doing with waste. Over to you, Matthew. You have a question or comment?
Couple of questions. Hey, Brian, good to see you. Wow, great talk. I have a couple questions. This and since you're an economist, I'm gonna try to dive in there. How there's actually I have two questions. One is around the economics of this, and one is around the transportation of food. So maybe we should start with the latter one first. do you see the building of these ontologies tying into, having touch points not just to the food and the process, but actually the length of the supply chain? Because I would imagine there's a fair amount of food that's wasted the longer the supply chain is. And there's additional energy input into that supply chain, just in terms of food miles. Have you looked at that part yet? Or is it, sort of on the roadmap? Am I correct in more spoilage
Yeah.
happens where these things are?
Yeah, and so, I mean, when you talk to people like at Feeding America, which again is kind of they probably impact on about 60 to 70% of food banks nationally. Their big initiative is to capture food that's predicted to be wasted at the distribution center rather than at the retail store. So
Right.
they can quickly identify and limit, get it earlier in the shelf life, and also then reduce the transportation. So an ontology that helps with tracking that and allowing for that prediction to take place so that the food is captured at the distribution center, or maybe even at the processor level. If there's a huge crop of tomatoes this year, and everybody just knows tomato prices are in the dumps because there's so many of them, maybe you can capture them at the processor even before they get to the distribution center, and then immediately route them to food banks in need that can actually still use them. That's where an ontology that can support data along the supply chain can help those predictive models kick in earlier and then save that transportation and also get it earlier in the shelf life, so it's much less likely to be wasted. Is that kind of where you're headed with that, Matthew?
Yeah. I'm also wondering about how this may support the argument for urban farms, urban gardens, places of production that are closer to communities as opposed to having longer, more brittle chains.
No, I think there's some play there. The big difference there, of course, is economies of scale are so powerful at the production level. It's really hard to overcome through the distributed model. It's probably very crop specific though. And so I think we're seeing like microgreens. They work perfectly well, I think, in kind of vertical urban settings. Sweet corn, probably not going to be a big urban crop at any point, just because of the economies of scale and scope and things like that. So
this is kind of where I was headed, was an ontology linked food linked to supply chains and linked to sort of deterioration and economies of scale. All four of those different touch points would be needed to build essentially an AI system that could reason over what would be the best things for an urban garden to grow, something like that.
Yeah, and they'd have to be kind of aggregated up to the regional level so that metropolitan area X knows that it's a bit deficit in this, and the prices here are always higher because they're in a weird part of the distribution spoke, and the economies of scale are not really that strong anyway. So yeah, go for it and prioritize this crop here. Yeah.
Great. That's great. We hit the economics question in the middle of the distribution question, so that was perfect. I'm done.
Damien, you said you had a couple questions too.
Yeah. I do. I'll sort of shotgun questions. On the one hand, of course, food processing, we're trying to even get away from the word waste and just model food processing and then have these different outputs just channeled and called something else, giving value to them. Process modeling, is your project essentially to really focus on process modeling so that whatever the process is, the duration of it, the outputs of the fat, the steak, and then the fat trimmings, naming it down to that level, identifying, giving a name to the outputs of food processing along the chain, and then trying to see how much industry is actually taking advantage of those outputs versus what we now call waste, which, how do you define that? Is that stuff going straight to the dump along the chain, or is that as a result of spoilage or as a result of just regular food processing processes? So that's what, how do you define waste? Are you having any troubles defining waste or not? I guess that's the
I think so. I think this has been, in fact, a notorious topic in this literature. I think somebody once counted that there were double-digit definitions of waste in published literature. Maybe it was triple, but it was something crazy. And so there's been much haranguing about what is waste, and there are different lenses through which you can view that. And so as an economist, I've always said, what you want is to define the set of products that people demand and actually want. And then any deviation in the inputs that don't end up meeting the specs for that final product is then, a step down from that. It's some form of waste to some degree, because it's not meeting its original intended point of origin, or point of exit, basically, into a human stomach, right? So the famous one as well, what if I feed my leftover steak to my dog? Is that really waste?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, if what you really wanted to have is a good meal for your dog, you probably wouldn't have had an Angus cow raised specifically for your dog. Maybe you would have, but probably most people wouldn't have wanted a Angus cow raised in Kansas, and then fed X number of months and then transported in 5 different ways. There probably would have been a better way to have sourced protein for your dog than by that means. The same with compost. People say, well, we're making compost from our that wasted kale that Diane couldn't use. It's like, well, there's probably cheaper and more efficient ways to make that compost than to grow the kale, ship it 5 different places, have it stored in somebody's refrigerator for 2 weeks, and then be carried by a composter to a central location, right? So to me, it's an economic question whether it's waste, if you are having to add additional resources and then end up with a lower value product than originally intended.
Tangential to that, cultural models of food purchasing. So of course, I love the European model where you walk down the street to the local store and get veggies. You can sort of see already that's kind of local sink and source. North America, drive 5 kilometers to the supermarket. So, well, both you and Matthew, I presume, are trying to focus on an ontology that is covering transportation and distribution terminology and processes.
It probably won't be central, but I'm sure it would be very important to have connections to if good ontologies exist in that area already.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it's important to be able to connect to those appropriately. Matthew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, first of all, we need a budget to do that, which means writing another proposal. And I'm sure Hande's going to chime in here with some thoughts about that. Probably nowhere graph is on Hande's mind. I could be wrong, but which would be an important piece. But also, yeah, I think this. You're enumerating the reasons, Damien, that we need a food systems ontology foundry. And I know we've been talking about it for a while, but this is one more reason that we need a foundry specifically for food systems, because they're more complicated than just biological systems, and they have other considerations. So yeah, anyway, Hande, please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Definitely in Graph and other systematic approaches to handle.
What's the word graph? I'm so sorry. I
I'll
don't
put a
know.
link in the chat. I'll put a link in the chat.
Yeah. And also another aspect of this, and I know you briefly touched on it, is what are the systematic approaches and what are the, consistent ways of building these ontologies so they work together. Although Foundry has a number of principles that they work with, but there are also other initiatives and other methodologies that we can use to make sure that these ontologies work together well. I see Kai is chiming in, and he is also touching on how ontologies need a lot of work and a lot of development effort, and it's definitely very true. And for them to, yes, and they have to communicate with Obo Foundry ontologies, because a bunch of them, as Matthew put in the chat, and there's also other efforts though, because for example, in Novagraph, there is a systematic deepening grid system where they put in to make sure that they're handling the transportation parts and the geographical, geospatial aspects of ontology in a better way. So long story short is that I think looking at these systematic approaches and methodologies and how we build these ontologies is also equally important as a subject matter. And I think that's been kind of out of scope for a lot of people for a very long time, but I think it's kind of catching up as we speak.
I have a few comments on that area. Basically, in data science, we're trying to redo what the folks that made up Esperanto did. We are trying to create a language that's common enough that we can all talk it, no matter which domain of science we're in. Now, I can report out that Susan Michie and a few others have realized that although a number of the social science related ontologies might be registered in Obo Foundry, that they still need to really chat within themselves to develop this new space. So they've all gone and created a little registry that I dropped the link in there called BSSO Foundry, and I'll just screen share. And I'm doing this because I can see the argument Matthew is making that we need a focused set of people in the food science realm. There's still a little bit of a problem of domain overlap, but let's see, I'll just share screen and then show this sort of fledgling BSSO Foundry. Now, I just signed up to the bulletin board and I thought I didn't know why I didn't see anything. It's because it's so new that I was actually the first one to put a notice in it. But what this little BSSO Foundry is doing, and you'll see some familiar names from Obo Foundry, Susan Michie, Jana Hastings, Hogan. They have their listserv there, and what you'll see is when you look at the list of ontologies, addiction, behavior change, mental functioning, emotion. So all of these are consumerist things, as well as social things and decision-making things, mental side of things that Obo Foundry hasn't done so much so far, because it's mostly on the biological and medical science end of things. So they recognize that they like the curational infrastructure that Obo Foundry has struggled to create in the last 15 years, the curation attitudes and use of common relationships. But what they also recognize is that they need to chart the interactions between these tools. And let me just jump through. Well, actually, I don't have to. They have a visualizer and so on. So anyway.
Can you please put that link in the chat, Damien? Because I tried typing it in and I'm not getting something. So
okay, yeah. Let's see. Did I just close it?
Yeah, you did.
Okay,
You need to re-close tab.
I put it right here. So
great.
into chat. So at a very basic level, just grouping food-related ontologies and creating the discussion board to get discussion going. I mean, that's even just like a preliminary step to a grander vision of things. That doesn't hurt. But in terms of the actual economics of things, and food, the fact that people have to consume it, it's sort of like gasoline. You got to distribute it. You got places where it's produced. You got alternative fuel concepts impinging. You've got a distribution network, transportation. So to think that food is just the problem, well, yes, maybe perishability. Gasoline doesn't perish like food does, but you're going to find a lot of crossroads off to other things. So maybe don't name all these ontologies, food this, food that. Maybe a distribution ontology that can stand on its own and support different kinds of consumerist
Well, we've talked about this even at the process level, right? Like a food processing ontology should really have parent terms from a more generalized processing ontology, right? A food transportation ontology should have more generalized terms from a transportation ontology. A food equipment ontology, which shouldn't have anything to do with the oboe foundry because it's equipment, would come from a more generalized equipment ontology. These kinds of things.
Industry foundry pretty mature or not?
Which one?
You mentioned industry ontology foundation. Is that hypothetical or is that real?
It's real. But the issue there is so Barry Smith and a few others from NIST have focused on trying to create a variant on BFO involving a lot more complicated time stuff to be able to model industrial processing more meticulously. But I think what they've come up with, confronted is the education issue of trying to educate corporate America and global corporations on this use of particular use of and curation of ontology. So it's shifted into just trying to figure out the education side.
Yes, speaking maybe for corporate America, they barely know the word. So that's why I hang out with y'all.
Okay.
It was interesting. I mean, some of these, I believe it was Winnow or Lean Path, they knew exactly, maybe they were using terms of vocabularies, but I know they said they hired 3 PhDs for 6 months to develop their own in-house ontology. And so they're spending real money on these issues to get it squared away for their commercial applications, but then that's all in-house and probably not interoperable outside of their own system. So.
Yeah, that's number one thing about trying to create these shared vocabularies. You need multi-agency, multilateral participation, and that, of course, is a slow process.
Is there a sense for how many of these privately held vocabulary ontologies there are, and kind of the lost economic benefit from holding those internally?
Yeah, siloed approach to information, intellectual property. BASF is developing their whole own agriculture ontology precisely to do farm to market stuff. I know that. To what extent they can piggyback on top of the open source Esperanto approach remains to be seen. Kai, do you have a comment or two?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say, so something that kind of frustrates oboe people is that we kind of got stuck with the name oboe, Open Biological and Biomedical Ontologies Foundry. Just because it came from that doesn't mean that it's all about that. I would say it's at least the life sciences ontology, if not more the chemical and life sciences, and branching into more things like physics, as well as other, sometimes even social domains. So I think that yes, oboe does not own ontologies, but I have yet to be pointed to a systematic set of tools and communities that work together to solve cross-disciplinary problems across much more than just biological domains in a concise, consistent way that we will still be talking about in more than 5 years, I promise you. So that all being said, I'm not opposed to any such efforts, but like realistically, oboe has been something that like hundreds of people have dedicated a lot of their life to. So for me, if you can't beat them, join them. That's my approach to things. But not discouraging anyone from doing anything else. I'm just saying, like, you have to be realistic in terms of what you're fighting against, the entropy of the universe of trying to create new things. So getting on the right train that's already left the station in a good way is what I recommend. That's all.
Yeah.
What fraction of oboe has some social content to it? Tiny or growing or?
Well, so the point of oboe is that you could spin up a new ontology. There's tools for doing that, right? They're like, you could say, I want to create the gender something something ontology. Someone did that somewhat recently. I don't know exactly how long ago, whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is, it's a not exactly traditional biology ontology. There are tools, the ontology development kit, ODK. There's tools for LinkML, which is actually like how to use ontologies together. A lot of these things supported by some of our chief collaborators at Lawrence Berkeley. There's Robot, the ontology development tools, command line tools, that's supported by Knowledge Ocean, more people who are involved with the Foundry. The point is, oboe is like a set of tools, not just a set of vocabularies. And those tools should not be ignored. Like, if you don't want to use them, don't use them, but don't reinvent the wheel either. If you want to make the food distribution systems ontology, I would recommend you boot it up using ODK. You post it to people who are relevant, who might be able to help you, open source people who are already part of oboe. I'm saying don't reinvent the wheel. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Matthew.
Yeah. So this is a good debate. I've had this debate a number of times. And I'm not proposing that anybody reinvent any wheels, just to be clear. I think the core competency of oboe is biology. Now, maybe it's branched into some areas, but the core competency, and even the core competency, has been focused really around the biomedical domain. More specifically, if you look at the history of oboe, that's really where it's coming from. I brought the first concept of food to the ICBO conference way back in, I think it was 2008, before there was a food on, when it really was biomedically focused. And it's gotten better for sure. But the reality is that all of those lessons that oboe's learned as a foundry could be extended to partner foundries that have the same principles, that use the same tools, that have core competencies and are led by people who have expertise in other domains. I think it makes sense for foundries to, in some sense, stay in a lane around their disciplinary expertise, because the building of ontologies is really about either domain building, or it's about application building, domain ontologies or application ontologies, really. And we could argue about other kinds of ontologies, but I think mostly that's what we're talking about. And when we get into things that are outside of the biology domain, yes, there's lessons to be learned from how oboe's done things. There's the principles of oboe are amazing, and we're building those principles into an ontology at Icicle for supercomputers and hardware that has nothing to do with biology. And I wouldn't want to have to explain all of that to the biologists who are at the helm of oboe. I would rather take the framework they have, utilize the principles that they have, including the terms that we might use from oboe foundry ontologies, in other ontologies that are more appropriate for things like describing supercomputer facilities and sensors and things like that.
I want to chime in here, and I know some of you were there, but at the US to TS, we also had a conversation about this with oboe foundry present, and not everyone, obviously, but it was a panel that had a lot of people, and it seems like oboe foundry is also, in parts, not everyone, recognizing there is a need for this kind of approach where it's actually feeding one another and not really competing with one another. So I think a lot of the things that Matthew said has a lot of validity and needs further discussion among the communities.
Matthew, I would say I agree with everything you said, except for the main focus being on domain specific things. I think there's a lot of focus on domain specific stuff, but I actually think that a lot of the expertise is on how to build ontologies themselves. And that's something that I would say you should leverage other people like Obo's expertise. That's all I'm saying.
That's fair. That's fair.
I certainly see at the OBO operations level that
Yeah.
it's not domain specific. The discussions are fascinatingly about annotations that should be used, how to incorporate DC terms properly with the URLs, how to governance. There's a ton of governance, as Andy can address right now, to getting a group of different agencies together to actually do this stuff together. So it's quite fascinating and a historic moment that will last a decade or two. But anyway, okay, so more on this concept of waste. So I'm interested. So Brian, you were able to sort of fly in with a general presentation, and you've got a massive collection of agencies interested. Where are the gaps right now in terms of the actual ontological? Like right now, you're in a gap analysis about what ontologies are out there, and then you identified there are a number of key teams that actually want to pick up on more of an ontology standardization approach to start developing their stuff. Where are you at with that?
Yeah, and I'll defer to Matthew since this is kind of a joint work between groups here, but the only place there has been progress, it seems to be, is in valorization. And so there are some, namely European-based ontologies that have been stood up there on valorization. So, but even there, they don't seem to be dynamically connecting to anything else. It seems to be kind of standalone and static or occasionally updated. So I would say that in the food recovery space and in the prevention space is where there's very little coverage. Okay. Matthew, I don't know what your thoughts here as well. Looking at that scoping review output as well.
Yeah, well, having a spouse who's made her career in valorizing waste products, specifically in dairy streams, but also in other foods. I think that that is a place where there are that's something that could probably actually in some regards live in an Obo Foundry type universe, at least until a food systems foundry could be built. Now, just to take it back 1 second, there's no reason an ontology itself couldn't live in multiple foundries where domain people could find them. Just to be clear, and so I think that there's the idea there is a consortium of foundries that could utilize some of the same tools, operations, things like that, principles. But to bring this back to the recovery aspect, I think in some ways that's one of the sort of key pieces that is perhaps low-hanging fruit, where active discoveries are being made by scientists around the world about how to reuse molecular components from various waste streams and transform them into other products. A simple example is something that perhaps everybody knows now, which is whey protein isolate. Now, it used to be that whey was a byproduct of cheese making, but as it turns out, thanks to bodybuilders and health foods advocates, whey protein isolate has become a thing that was isolated from whey, which used to sit in a pond outside of a dairy farm or a dairy processor, and slowly evaporate into something. Well, now we've got these methods to make whey protein isolate. Turns out that that stuff's way more valuable than the cheese that it was made from. So now, if you were to look at it from an economic point of view, cheese is a byproduct of making whey protein isolate, and so the economics have flipped. And I think that these kinds of stories, we're probably going to see a lot of them, but we just don't know what's in these components. And so that active discovery of biomolecules that are in some of these things is a huge part of what's happening. And that science, lots of people are engaging in that science, and having a computable infrastructure there for that kind of thing to happen could have a major impact.
Yeah, I am so hoping that milk, for example, can be produced from yeasts and that I actually like it. Because that, it sounds like we'll solve at least a third of the global agricultural land use problem right there. But I would like to draw attention to, and first, Magali Weber. She is a paper under review process on, and that's INRAE's drive to create an ontology based on their PO2 ontology, previous ontology, but introducing a whole bunch more process terms, integrating with EFSA's FoodX2 vocabulary. And so and she's eager to participate in this food process ontology work group that I've just dropped a link into the chat about for those of you who are interested in working on continuing the work on the food process stuff, which touches on everything you're talking about, Brian. But at a technical level, like trying to hash through how to create, for example, between process on and food on and others, a process ontology. Bit of news there. OB is willing to take on the upper level process ontology terms around biological and chemical processes outside of the biomedical domain into the general material processing domain. So barring anyone else stepping forward to create a standalone process ontology, we would take maybe the top 20 terms and try to get them into OB or COB through OB curation. And that's something we would discuss in the process ontology modeling group. Process on has got a whole bunch of terms there related to food waste. And so we would want to be figuring out how across the pond to integrate the two. Process on isn't quite in Obo Foundry. It's using SSN sensor ontology and time ontology and provenance. I'm not sure that means. No, not that. Anyway, what else to say? I think that's about it for me. Tool reuse. Yeah,
I
so
think part of our struggle in recipes is understanding. I think we now understand how vast the task is versus the very slim part of budget that we dedicated to this in the overall network. And so just trying to understand how to bridge the aspiration to the actual resource need to be do something meaningful. How to deal with that. And so I think that's our challenge for recipes, is trying to minimally point out the issue and then maximally trying to then find resources that actually start to address it for real, because obviously I think we now understand the types of amount of dedication would take to really make a dent in this.
yeah. Others? If not, I can finish with one little shocking piece of news yesterday, which I dropped the link into, and it's related to food waste. So America and Europe have banned forever chemicals of a certain variety. Canada has not. We're always like paying attention to what FDA does and responding a few years later. But so it turns out Canada did ban plastic bags, single-use bags in grocery stores about half a year ago. But it turns out that the packaging that food producers are now using, especially for fast food, contain these forever chemicals in the paper material that is now being substituted for the plastic. And these forever chemicals, normally people aren't that sensitive to them if you touch paper that has them, but people are taking these cardboard moisture preventative treated forever chemical containers and putting them in their compost because they look like they're compostable. And that gets the stuff right into their organic soil and right into their tummies on the next year's crop of their garden. So this was quite a shock to me. And hopefully other Canadians will now write letters to their MLAs saying we've got to ban them here too. And just an example of where you think your beautiful organic feed the compost is backfiring tremendously in terms of personal health at the moment in Canada.
Yes, and I don't even think that they check for those forever chemicals in the organic supply streams.
Right. So this article is just about how much they're discovering them in the fast food and how easily they convey right into compost.
Yeah,
No,
those,
we've got research, we're looking at microplastics. I think that's a slightly different issue, but also problematic. How that can be compost. Sorry, nothing.
no, I was just gonna say, all of those plastics that are microwave safe and all of those waxy kind of coated things that you get food in, they pretty much all contain environmental estrogens, things you don't want.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of the question about shorter supply chains. We don't need to wrap things up in plastic if we're using shorter supply chains. So it's interesting, Brian. I think that there's we've got the food waste, a food waste ontology, as it were. So I actually I know we're at time, but if we back up 1 second, if we get to this place where we're modeling all these various aspects, then a new ontology really is not so much about creating terms, it's about creating a perspective on the world, right? And I'm going to say, I'm going to use these terms from this ontology and these terms from this ontology and these terms from this ontology. If I'm using the Obo Foundry principles, I'm going to reuse terms. And here's how I bring these together to describe X phenomena. And so I think one of the challenges for food waste is to say, okay, what are all those other ontologies that we're going to need to connect to? We need to connect to food waste. We need to connect to packaging. We need to connect to transportation. We need to connect, right? Like, and so I would encourage you maybe to think about those kinds of, what are all the domain touch points that even if you don't have the ontology built, what's sort of that meta structure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are at time, but I will just slip in one other idea. I was recently discussing with some other oboers one little design flaw that Obo had from the start, which is that we let each ontology create its own prefix and then numeric ID for terms. Now, when it came to declare domains and to trade terms and transfer management of terms over, now we have this deprecate term and move it over there, change it in the database to keep up to date complexity. We realized you could do you could do ISBN or DOI style identifiers for ontology. So a radical idea would be to switch to that. It's still Obo Foundry compatible, but allow different curators, teams of curators, to curate terms under the hood and have a resolution declare who's actually managing those terms. Anyway, that's it. I see we're dropping off. Thank you so much, Brian and
Thank
Rand,
you.
for your work, and we look forward to hearing more from you as you progress.
Thank
Okay,
Thank you all.
Bye.
bye.